Good afternoon. My name is Varus Oswe from the University of Fribourg, PhD in political philosophy, ethics and politics, specialization in human rights. I will approach a problem, some certain problem of pertaining to positivism. As I've started it at the end of the first part of this course entitled Enlightenment, Politics, Science and Science of Law as Immediate Influences from Philosophical Anthropology. As I was saying, during the first part of the course of this lecture, the course fits the module 2 of law science, course supposed to be given within the discipline law science. Module 2 then, reference number 00600204. This part of the course seemed to me less systematic than the previous, but I will try to bring them to the same level of quality. Anyway, so I've been talking about positivism, about tyranny, despotism, anarchy in the first part of my course. This part of the course continue and give some more precision, launch attacks on positivism, legal positivism in particular. Despotism and anarchy represent the primary taboos of social political philosophy. It is a double negation that helps define a good constitution or fundamental law of a state. A double negation which, seen from the perspective of moral politics or ethics, there comes the idea of the inalienability and imprescriptibility of fundamental rights, rights not to be alienated or forfeited by citizens among themselves or derogated by the state. It is perfectly clear that a state scrupulously respectful of these rights will have a free moral approval from its citizens. The state will win their sympathy. It is also without doubt that a providential or welfare state which really cares for the welfare of its citizens, a state which does not fiercely brandish the slash or the sword in its right and in its right hand, while tending bread or food in its left, will be praised for its redemptory accomplishment. But the tyrannical or despotic state, on the contrary, and in the extremes of the cases, will lack the providential commitment that characterizes the welfare state, and consequently will be blamed by its citizens. In the long run, this situation will make all pacific coexistence impossible. As we have been talking about distinguish between fundamental rights and on the one hand and social, political, social, cultural, economical rights on the other, problem of tyranny on the practical level, despotism on the practical level, or anarchy at the same level will be approached just, as I said before, not really deeply, but some underlining some of the trappings of these problems. On the theoretical level, these problems are usually discussed when one engages in a criticism against legal positivism. This is why the concept of tyranny, the concept or the distinction rather, let's say, the distinction between the two types or two categories of rights will be surveyed here again, and we'll try to show how legal positivism is the soil where all misgovernance, despotic government, tyrannical government, tyranny of majority, and all those things can be emerge as the flaws of the political organization. Theoretically, then, there is a classical debate between the two schools. The first are the deontologies, liberal. The second are the eudaemonist liberals. What is deontology? Liberal deontology. And what is liberal eudaemonism? Deontology, as we know in political or in moral philosophy, is the doctrine, like the Kantian, which propounds an unconditional respect of rights, of dignity of people, of a human person. Human dignity or human rights are principles that should not be outweighed by any consideration of happiness or welfare. This is deontology, liberal deontology. On the other side, we have the liberal eudaemonism. Eudaemonism coming from eudaimonia in ancient philosophy, especially the Aristotelian, meaning happiness, or nowadays political system we will say, or legal system we will say, welfare, principle of welfare or well-being. So We'll underline some of the reason why there should be a principle or an argument that will bring human rights and welfare or human happiness together, so as to make human rights one and indivisible principle underlying our political culture. Since the respectability of human rights as fundamental right is universally admitted by both citizens and states as well, they can be promoted to the rank of principles transcending other principles of rights such as happiness or welfare. Even if happiness or welfare is to be considered the ultimate end of existence, as Immanuel Kant said, the universal end of the public in his Doctrine of Rights. Such a promotion of fundamental rights, however, signifies the primacy of political liberalism of the deontological sorts and of its principles, negative rights or freedom rights, in detriment of welfare liberalism. A liberalism of an eudaemonist sort, which, on the contrary, enlists happiness or welfare among the fundamentals of rights, that is, welfare rights among the fundamental of rights, so as to make the notion of human rights an indivisible instance. To talk about primacy of negative or freedom rights, notwithstanding, should be strictly understood in relation with what we call a conflict momentum, which means that this primacy has no absolute significance. It is not an absolute or unconditional requirement to be observed. Conflict momentum, its primacy of fundamental rights will there be required only when there is a conflict between fundamental rights and or negative rights and positive rights. Whether there is such a moment where there is no conflict at all is one of the important questions. But we'll know that it's there sometime. I will not engage in any casuistic study now. In other words, the primacy to be granted the negative or freedom rights should occur if and only if there is a clear conflict between the implementation or enforcement of the two categories of rights. A conflict which may require an urgent choice among the rights enlisted within the two categories of rights. Furthermore, it should be remarked that the necessity of strong logical stance or argumentative exercise conducted to its last consequences left aside, situation of urgency that scarcely occur. It's my opinion. Well, if this is not the case, I will say that philosophy applied to human problems and its proper form or type of reasoning or argumentation, duly considered, seems not to be reduced to such a pure or formal logic, disincarnated and cold. To object to this point is to seal the death of philosophy as one expert in the field of ethics and social political philosophy, Ingeborg Schussler of Lausanne University in Switzerland, once asserted. Philosophy should rather consist in that form of body of living thoughts which emerge from the tradition, living systematics also, we should add, which emerge from the tradition, living thoughts, which also transform and open new avenues for further thoughts to be embodied within. The conclusion to be drawn from this line of argumentation, that is the indivisibility of human rights, is the following: a legitimate political order which seriously cares for social justice should also enforce conditions that bring about the realization of all the categories of human rights, such to heave up, to elevate to the second, third generation of rights to the level of fundamental rights, the classical first type of rights. For example, that political order should improve the degree of education, schooling and professional training, free time, revenues or income, etc., which enable caring more or entertaining for the body and life, and better assuming civic responsibility and affairs, etc. For poverty, ignorance, hardship, and strenuous way of working or strenuous condition of working generating stresses are all primary obstacles to the actualization of fundamental rights. If the previous line are true, then of necessity it is required from the state to take all the appropriate measures to eliminate the obstacle to the reign of rights, to the full realization of principle of human rights. Even Immanuel Kant, the most radical of the deontologies, will share our position. For in his theory and practice, despite his well-known rejection of happiness on the level of the foundational principle of moral and of rights, Kant affirms that the state which will not care for the welfare of citizens today, it is worthwhile to include of all people living under its territory or within the borders of its territory. If the state does not care for the welfare of citizens and for the people living within its borders, it will risk its own destruction, since not abiding by this principle will incite its own citizens to destabilize the republic or its enemies external to invade its territories as a consequence of its irresponsibility, lack of responsibility. Well, this is our translation. In Kant's word, my translation, if the supreme power edicts law which directly aim at promoting the happiness or the welfare of its citizens, the population, etc., it is not as the end of the establishment of the civil constitution, but solely as a means to guarantee the legal state, the juridical state, the legitimacy, so to say, particularly against enemies from outside. In such situation, the head of state should of necessity be authorized to judge by himself, and only by himself, le décret, as it's said in French. So, in such situation, can say the head of state should have necessity be authorized to judge by himself and only by himself if such measures, such as to provide the welfare or happiness of the citizen, are necessary for the prosperity of the republic, since this prosperity is indispensable for its power and solidity within and without, that is, against external enemies, if it is not to render the people more happy, so to say, against its wish, but only for the sake of keeping the state as a republic. One of the necessary conditions of maintaining the stability of the state's security is then the promulgation of laws appropriate for the promotion and the preservation of the welfare of the citizens. Our position on this point is closer to Kantian critics of the minimalist interpretation of happiness are part and parcel of the Kantian principle of politics or law. Our position make room for principle of happiness or welfare figure within the Kantian principle of politics or law science. And this position is generally called minimalist interpretation. But our position departs from the advocates of this minimalist interpretation within a very subtle point, which is the following. I qualify my position as a strictly bidimensional, or I call it bidimensional interpretation, which is something more than minimalist interpretation of the categorical imperative, with the concept of dignity as both a negative and positive concept. We all know in the systematic of the Kantian philosophy that the concept of dignity figure or the general tendencies or the interpretation make the concept of dignity not only negative principle, only negative concept, while I interpreted it the way that it can be seen as a positive concept. There are other people who share this position too, but most of like we all know in philosophy, problems come from the line of argumentation. So I interpret the concept of dignity, the Kantian concept of dignity, as both negative and positive, as providing the categorical imperative with a strongest principle, a stronger principle than the negative, the only negative aspect of this is what is called dignity. Well, the categorical imperative is interpreted as combining both itself as forbidding all that will go against the respect of the dignity of man, combining this concept of dignity with the aims, all of the aims that the person or the subject has to achieve, has to bring into action or achieve, let's say. All the aims, all the ends we want to achieve should be put together, including the respect of the human being as human being. This is what I call a bidimensional interpretation or cumulative interpretation of the categorical imperative. Again, my categorical imperative is combines both the categorical imperative itself and what Kant called hypothetical or pragmatic imperative, technical imperative and all. I am of this opinion because of one important concept in Kantian philosophy, moral philosophy, which is the realm of ends. If we pay attention to that concept, we'll see that the realm of ends combine all the kinds of ends we can decide to pursue as human being, as agent, moral agent. And what explain this kind of tendency or this interpretative line is another notion Kant call it well, I think that the notion that explain more coherently why it is necessary to provide the Kantian categorical imperative with a dimensional, bi-dimensional interpretation is these other concepts of Kant called synthetic and systematic unity of all ends. I think that this notion of synthetic and systematic unity of all ends provide or support the notion of realm of ends and helps enable a better understanding of the whole realm or the whole sphere of praxis, our human praxis, under the ruling weight or power of the categorical imperative. This is my position. And it's very important to bear into mind this interpretation of, by recourse with the concept of unity, this notion of unity, synthetic and systematic unity of all ends. That brings together categorical imperative itself and the technical, pragmatical imperative within. The necessity of doing so is just to avoid pure and abstract formalism, how to respect negative freedoms alone, only respect human dignity, and living beside all consideration of welfare. I wonder if that practically is possible at all, indeed. My interpretation then of the Kantian categorical imperative combine both this imperative self, which enjoins duty for duty's sake, respect for human rights by the state, negative and or liberty rights, and the hypothetical and pragmatic imperatives as well, positive rights and or welfare rights. It does so without in any way weakening, enfeebling the power of the categorical imperative. True it is that Immanuel Kant warned the confusion of welfare, warned against the confusion of welfare, better well-being and happiness with the formal principle of politics in his doctrine of rights. But is it less true? It is not less true that he also affirmed that one should not understand well-being of one's co-citizen and their happiness under the concept of the end of politics as being happiness, and that the notion of happiness, one should not understand the well-being because it is not to be excluded. As Rousseau meant it, it is not to be excluded that happiness can be more comfortable and more suitable in the state of nature. That means the absence of government at all, or even under a despotic government, but that what it is to be understood, what it is to be meaning by that state, what it is to be meaning is that state of redemption or salvation, that state of a greater concord or harmony between the Constitution and the principle of rights, in the sense that it is the very state or aim and toward which reason by a categorical imperative obliges us to tend to. What is important here is the notion of greater concord or greater harmony between the Constitution, which means between the basic rights as enlisted in a Constitution and the principle of rights. Here the principle of rights should include the caring for people's welfare. So it's the unity, the synthetic and systematic unity of those to end the respect of human right or human dignity and the respect of his needs, that is also his right as the state towards which under one government reason by the categorical imperative obliges us to stand to. So the notion of unity, synthetic and systematic unity of all ends is very important to provide, to support this bidimensional interpretation of the imperative, categorical imperative, or the bidimensional explanation, bidimensional concept of a human dignity within the moral principle of Kant. Well, we should adequately understand the axiological status of this principle in the doctrine of rights. That's what I think. In the Kantian classification of duties in perfect and imperfect duty, the promotion of the well-being of citizens or of happiness is included among the duties of benevolence. This duty can be excluded from those of justice proper, if only if there is a conflict between the unconditional respect of fundamental rights and the necessary promotion of citizens' well-being, say, between the respect of the former and the respect of the latter, which is not the less necessary. In the same doctrine of right, Immanuel Kant did not lay down, this is my wording of his thought, translation. It indirectly belongs the supreme chief of the state or head of the state that as one who should take the decision on the duty of the people, the right to impose on them certain number of taxes for their own conservation, that of the people, as it is for taxes to be alleviated in the benefit of the poor, for forsaken children, and for the church, that which is elsewhere called charitable or pious institution. So it's the duty of the state, the head of state, to impose taxes upon the rich people, the rich ones within the state, to help the poor, forsaken children, and the church achieve their goals or live. It is therefore by an order of the state can say that the government is justified, an order of the state, that the government is justified in urging upon the rich to provide those who cannot afford it with the means of their conservation, at least as concerns the most necessary natural needs, for the existence of rich is at the same time like an act of submission to the protection and to the solicitude of the republic. The reason why they have contracted obligation, an obligation serving as a basis for the state rights, to bring their parts of contribution to the subsistence of their co-citizens. The passage on the line shows as Kant did not consider the duty as take as what we call supererogative duty, in spite of its being imperfect. Just as a duty, we are under no constraint, serious constraint, a duty to perform, a duty of less compulsory nature. In spite of being imperfect, we are not under that, under this condition. The remainder of the passage clearly shows it. It enables us to assume the compatibility of principle between justice and the well-being or happiness in a Kantian deontological system. This compatibility can be read through in the Perpetual Peace and other works of Kant. At the end of the Perpetual Peace, where Kant discusses the principle of publicity, both enunciated are the negative version and the positive version of his principle. According to the negative version, a maxim will be moral discrepancy with the principle of right, will be in moral opposition with the principle of right, both public or national and international, if its publicity raises the disapproval of the people. If the people within the realm, within the state, within the borders of the state disapprove the publicity or will disapprove that a law enactment or that law, then that law is in moral opposition with the principle of right. This is the negative version of the principle of publicity. On the contrary, he said, a maxim will be morally conform with the principle of political rights, public or national and international, with the principle of justice, if its publicity calls for people's adherence. You see that disapproval of people is closely linked with the people's adherence of that law. Kant called this principle axiom of the public rights a transcendental and affirmative principle of public rights. Transcendental in the Kantian system is all that brings the principle into one and unique one and unique principle, under one and unique principle. And make them one as to impart them more weight, more power. All maxim, he said, that requires publicity, such as not to miss their end, accord with right and the politics altogether. With right and politics altogether. If those principles can reach their end, that means not to lend themselves to public criticism, people's criticism, and further, if they are such as promote or prompting people their sympathy, then that principle is in accordance with the politics and rights of the public and what is compulsory, such as the absolute respect for human dignity. For if they cannot reach their end, he continues, lest by publicity, they ought to conform with the universal end of the public. That means to happiness. The universal end of the public is what called happiness. And accord with it to make people satisfied with its state. To make people satisfied with its condition. And this is the true problem of politics. So we need not argue along to see how within the same scheme of theoretical configuration of Kantian politics, both concepts, though distinguished, strictly distinguished, are put together again so as to make them one and same principle, respect of human dignity as absolute, and the respect of human needs within the state or in life in general, so to say. It follows from what we have said that the state of rights and constitution should bear the responsibility to fulfill all the conditions whereby its citizen and the population can acquire revenues, education, and respectable social position, etc. This is one of the reasons why the so-called second, third generation of right can, en masse of necessity, form an integral part of the principle of justice of all political associations that claim to be just. The development of modern states, state of right and constitution, to a social state is a development deprived of arbitrariness. Development deprived of arbitrariness and compulsory on the point of view of political justice. Social rights become an integral part of politics in virtue of this compulsory development. Now let's see some simple argument in favor of the notion of natural rights, man and the citizen. The French Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen of 1789 expressly draw a distinction between the rights of man is entitled to and those citizen can legitimately claim. To right man is entitled to and those citizens can legitimately claim. It shows why it is necessary to ground human rights via and essentially anthropology, because it is important to seize its purpose, to grasp its purpose. Man in the Declaration, says Gérard Soulier, for example, is the human animal. Man in the state of nature universal that the 18th century philosopher considered, endowed with a certain natural entitlement, prerogative, rights inherent to his nature and which he cannot alienate. The citizens ask for him, said Gérard Soulier. He is a man in situ. The man contextualized man. A man living in a given society. The man abiding by a given state's law. Citizen. Man integrated in a given political system. His rights are political and hint at a certain type of social organization. He is a man invested with a political statute. The right to vote, for example. This distinction suggests that from the start, the idea of human rights is closely related to a certain theories, namely theories of nature and of social contract. Any other justification, it seems, that will rule out this theory, to our opinion, will lack the necessary epistemological vectors for its purposes, or key notions for its purposes. For the question here is how to adequately understand the idea of human right and fundamental right of citizens, rights opposable not only to the co-citizen and to the state, but also to any other man independent of consideration of citizenship. The main argument of critics of this theory of state of nature and social contract is that only the state, that is only within the constitutional framework, that a state generates or consecrates human and citizen rights. The recognition of such right proceeds from a solemn legal act, that is, a declaration and a political consensus. Therefore, there is no such things called the state of nature. All rights are legal and positive. As such, there is no sense to talk about human rights as inferior, inter, and supra-positive. Supporting this line of argumentation is the objection to the conceptual statute of the theories of state of nature and social contract as legitimatory, justificatory devices. Systematically seen, a methodological device. This type of criticism seems difficult, tenable. We then should ask, the following question: in which sense man can be said to be subject of natural and inalienable rights? One can argue as follows. According to the positivistic tenet, a subject of right is any person to whom a legal political organ recognizes a capacity of imputation, any person capable of legal and political responsibility, capable to legally respond to his act, any person capable to defend himself legally or sue a physical and or moral person in justice. A closer attention to the faculties here involved will reveal a whole range of powers of man as man, and these, however, are the powers on which the recognition of the status of subject of right are based. There are self-consciousness. These are self-consciousness, reason, freedom, or liberty of will, language. But simply put, no state has ever created nor granted to any man such power. It seems bold affirmation, but it follows the very line of argumentation that the positivists usually put forward. Positivists and natural or philosopher, all of them rely on these powers in support of their theories. But since, as just said, no state has ever created or granted to any man any of these powers or faculties, and since they are natural powers of man, as man, powers on which certain rights are said to be granted and recognized to them, aren't we entitled to declare these rights natural and following the spirit of the different declaration of rights, if not beforehand, and on account of natural passions and reactions of men, declare them inalienable? The natural inalienable character of these rights proceeds from the incapacity of any positive juridical or legal system, even the most tyrannical or despotic rule, to deprive its subject of these powers, to prevent them from the use of them. In the extreme case, the tyrannical or despotic state could prevent its subjects from externally manifesting the use of these powers through concrete actions, by some violent means of coercion, such as torture, but in no case he can be able to suppress them, lest he accept to be charged of murder, killing his own subject, charge of genocide, not killing his own subject, not their powers. In the worst case, he will reduce them to an overwhelming and suffocating silence, but even silence is a linguistic act, a language and act of consciousness, sometimes the most profound and most expressive, the most striking. Positivists cannot deny this fact, A question that positivists may raise against this line of argumentation is following. Can we logically deduce a right natura from the mere possession of these faculties or powers? The question is quite clear, but unfortunately paradoxical, and it can be turned against our adversary, can turn against the positivists. For their own thesis rely on the natural capacity of man, the capacity of imputation, which calls for the other natural powers afore enumerated. In both cases, it is clear that we cannot do without these natural powers. Even the so-called legal or juridical acts, whereby it is said the state recognizes or grants the subject their human and citizen right, is nonetheless a natural power, a declaration. That is a linguistic act performed in a non-contradictory way, an act of conscience. And since it's not an arbitrary legal letter, that means an enacted law, a non-arbitrary legal act, but rather an act of which tremendously calls for a rational justification. It is also an act to be performed through and through by reason, which is a natural power of man. Well, let us admit the positivity and legality, legal character of human right and fundamental right. The jurist naturalistic line of argumentation will still remain weighty, full of convincing power. For in the last resort, the idea of human rights include among the claimed rights as their ultimate consequences the right to disobedience, resistance, and revolt. Will the state ever be accountable for some serious contrivances destructive for the political society? In the last result, the idea of human rights include among the claimed rights as their ultimate consequences the right to disobedience, resistance, and revolt. If the state is accountable for some serious contrivances destructive for a political society. The right, however, stands against the entity which is supposed to recognize or grant them, which is self-contradictory, and which amount to the following thesis: I recognize and grant you this right, so that whenever you think fit, you can stand against me and overthrow me if need be. We may say, what a benevolence. How to understand a state enactment which authorizes citizens in virtue of their having some prerogative as human beings to act against its sovereignty, against its own conservation. What we are talking about when we say the ultimate recourse or resort is the ultimate, what is called conservation of the self-preservation, the conatus. According to the modern legal philosophical thought, if not also the antique, the principle of self-preservation at work in man is a universal dynamics, the conatus, of all creatures, as Spinoza would have it said. The slave alienates his freedom for his own preservation. The martyr accepts his lot, death, for the preservation of what for him is the dearest in life, his dignity. The Christian sacrifices his life for his eternal preservation. The one who puts an end to his life, puts his life to an end, who commits suicide, say, may be doing so just to avoid the corruption of his integrity, physical and or moral or mental, or just to avoid physical suffering. The truth it is that this line of argumentation can be easily perceived by those akin to suicide as an encouragement to suicide, but our intention is far from this kind of installation. It rather consists in emphasizing the importance of the notion of self-preservation of conatus in the realm of political justice, le droit politique. Just like in Sophocles' tragedy entitled Antigone, the emphasis is rather laid on the sharp conflict between despotic or tyrannical political power and the legitimate interests of those who compose the juridical political space. This conflict can easily lead to the alienation or resignation of the lives and liberty of the latter and their surrendering in the hands of the wicked rulers. But it can never be a question of a right to self-murder or suicide, since the concept of human rights originally is to be opposed to despotism or tyranny and to anyone who intends to make use of power without right on the lives, liberties, and property of citizens and men, and though with what passes a mere price, dignity. For this reason, he who claims for a right to suicide will conceptually depart from the root signification of the concept of human and fundamental rights. Basically, this thematic has no sense outside the sphere of struggle for recognition or life. It does not deal with the preservation of any morbid instinct of death, let alone death itself. But with the preservation, it deals with the preservation of life, of what render it possible and worth living. The notion of self-preservation seems to be one of the most important, if not the most, notion whereby a response can be brought forth to question pertaining to the fundamental significance of a human right as natural and inalienable. The critical reflection on law in modern state holds it to be a major and central concept. It bears the statute of axiom, a rational principle that makes possible not only the individual existence but also that of the state and its science, that is politics. It should be understood and underlined that it is far from being a modern concept, for it proceeds from the secularization of medieval thought, political thought, which in turn leads us back to Aristotle. In a preface to the Declarations of Rights of Man and Citizen, Lucien Jaume has rightly emphasizes, he points, the philosophy of law and modern state. He asserted, rightly considered individual preservation as a major problem that is encountered by the modern man, as also the absolute value in the light of which the utility and the efficiency of society and government should be judged. The normative statute of this notion in the realm of the critical thought on modern law and state and in the philosophies of the diverse projects leading to the declarations of before and after 1789 receive more precision from the part of Lucien Jaume. Numerous projects of declaration before and after 1789 explicitly begin with this thesis: the soul and end of society is individual preservation, is the individual preservation and happiness. Society does stand as a means in the service of the individual, as a means to serve individual, whose greatest conceivable evil is death, as the philosopher hopes, with an equal vigor has laid down. This is also what is meant by the Declaration of 1809, the French Declaration, which asserts in its second article, the end of all political association is the preservation of natural and imprescriptible rights of man. Preservation of natural rights is the preservation of the individual himself. A partial conclusion is worth making here. To ensure their conservation, individuals need this sort of juridical or legal and political organ, which is the state. Likewise, to maintain itself as means for the survival or preservation of its subject, the state needs its own preservation. Yet this end is conditioned by the same guarantee for the preservation of its subjects in their properties, intrinsic and extrinsic, that is, life, liberty, properties, and all that make them possible. The conclusion of this succinct study of the principle of self-preservation as the zero degree of politics and its logical and ethical political implication is the history. In the history of modern political philosophy clearly follows. To really guarantee the preservation of the multitude selves within the sphere of the state, that is, to both theoretically ground and practically efficiently ensure the natural rights of man, it is necessary, at least important, to do it via a contractualist theory, with a thesis that stipulates the inalienability of natural rights. Second, a theory of authorization with a central thesis, the relative and limited power of the executor of the sovereignty. Consequently, rejection of absolute power in defense of a moderate power with a theory of natural and inalienable rights should be the alternative to a positivistic foundation of human rights. Only a theory like that of John Locke, the most important natural law theories of modern times, is the one appropriate to an intelligible defense of rights to disobedience, resistance, and to revolution. So let's conclude now, shortly, our lecture, today's lecture. All the studies undertaken on positivism unanimously have clearly shown the incapacity or limits of a purely legal positivism. In any fundamental legitimization of juridical, legal, and political values, namely those qualified as inalienable rights of man. Not only pure legal positivism reveals a profound lack in its approach on the task of any relative legitimation or legitimization of the fundamental philosophical and metaphysical postulate or presupposition that its advocates just silence, but it also lack principle that legitimate or intelligibly help explain historical changes that positive norms, laws, and rules are subject to. For even within the perspective of legalism and positivism, it always needs a standard of just and the unjust to operate and justify such changes, unless they are just matter of obscure forces that work in man and in nature or in people as a herd. It always needs a transcending norm to abandon or abrogate existing laws in the profit of new ones. This mortal phobia of the normative remains silent on the following question. Can the legal normativity be regulatory without itself being grounded on an original validity? Can the juridical norm be regulatory without itself being grounded on original norm or value. Some of the greatest positivists of our times have clearly perceived. This is the example of Kelsen, which is one of the most striking. The example of Kelsen is one of the most striking as a positivist that have discarded all that sounds metaphysical or all philosophical ideas. It's a legal thing. Kelsen could not help noticing the necessity for positivism to call for original or root norm, Urnorms in German. Positivism, according to him, should call for an original norm. And as Simone Goya-Fabre, a French philosopher of law, have remarked, the difficulty for positivism to open its gate for axiological dimensions of law, so accurately perceived by Kelsen, explains to which extent he is distant from one Carré de Malberg, a constitutional thinker. That is how Kelsen, tended towards normativism, while Carré de Malberg linked the juridical or legal order to the principle of national representation, where lies the cornerstone of the state constitution, which as such remains a matter of legal positivism. Kelsen, via his specific approach, inherited from Kantian criticism, based the legal order on a transcendental logical hypothesis of the Grundnorm or Urnorm, which is subject to any positivistic procedure, which is not paused, but only hinted at, which is not subject to any positivistic procedure. For it cannot be paused, it cannot be a matter, its enactment cannot be a matter of any positivistic declaration. It can only be presupposed or supposed as the very condition of possibility and validity of the pyramid of the positive law. In the last resort, the question remains to know whether it is possible to have a legal system of whatever scientific turn without at first a certain idea of philosophy, of man or anthropology, and of the world attached or value attached to him. Why is it necessary to project man from the legal rouage or mechanism? This is a simple question rigorously dealt with, which will lead us to the theme of natural right and natural law, to the unavoidable concept of preservation of the intrinsic and or extrinsic properties of man, to its correlate theories such as the theories of contract and the like. The least to say is that the notion of properties of intrinsic attributes, which calls for consideration of an ontological order, if not merely anthropological, on man and the other realms of the diverse being, seem to be a primitivistic notion for the advocates of legal positivism and for the most part of the theories of our times. But to be pertinent, this is far from being true. The reason why is that legal positivism that present the legal order refer to it just like positivistic and positivists and the most contemporaneous theories. They are recourse to them. Indeed, the whole conception of fundamental rights and liberty find its most primeval original basis in this notion, as in its cornerstone. It is therefore useful to shift the debate opposing natural law and right theories and positivist thinkers of sociological and culturalist turn of mind, this debate should be shifted to a lower level, say, to a second universe of discourse, that of the juridical or legal techniques or professional practice, say pragmatics. But it should answer the following question: how to put into effect the idea of human rights within the different societal conditions. Our discourse universe or universe discourse is that of the foundation of the Ur norm, the primordial norm of law and moral right, the primordial conditions of law in Kantian time, the preliminary, le préalable, in the translation provided as given to us by Kant's critics, it's called le préalable, necessary for any legal system, which in modern times have received the qualification of fundamental rights and liberty and their justification. Thank you very much for your attention. I recall that these lectures, two lectures, the first and the second part, are to be included or enlisted among those of the module 2, reference number 0060, 02, and 04. Thank you very much once again.